Good evening and welcome to our first University Days 2022 virtual lecture. I'm Carol Allman-Morton, Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at Berkshire Community College. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land here in Berkshire County, or especially where we are at Berkshire Community College. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. We are committed to act in partnership and with the support of Indigenous peoples of the Northeast as we learn about their history, celebrate their culture, and engage with their artists, writers, musicians, naturalists, and scholars. I would like to name my gratitude to the volunteers who have made this program and all the programs for We Are Still Here possible. Thank you for your time, your passion, and your willingness to share your experience and gifts with our community. Thank you to PCTV for recording and distributing this lecture. I encourage you to look at the full schedule of events for the We Are Still Here Indigenous Peoples of the Northeast program, and I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. And if any BCC students are here and would like forum credit, please send me a direct message with your name and student ID number, and I'll make sure that it gets submitted. And thank you for coming. So now I'm going to turn things over to Ellen Quabier, a member of our OLLI board, co-chair of the membership committee and University Days committee member. Ellen.
Great. Thank you very much, Carol. I have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight. Margaret M. Bruchac, who is Abenaki, is an associate professor of anthropology, associate faculty in the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and coordinator of Native American and Indigenous Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. In her multimodal career as a performer, ethnographer, historian, and museum consultant, Bruchac has long been committed to critical studies of colonial histories, archives, and museums, while developing interpretations of Indigenous histories that challenge erasures and stereotypes. She has served as a consultant on Northeastern Native American history for exhibitions and events at the American Philosophical Society Museum, Historic Deerfield, Old Sturbridge Village, Plymouth Plantation, and the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association, among other museums. She has received research fellowship awards from the American Philosophical Society, 5 colleges, Ford Foundation, and the School for Advanced Research, among others. At Penn, Dr. Bruchac directs a restorative research project, the Wampum Trail, that focuses on the meaning, materiality, curation, and repatriation of historical wampum objects over time. Her 2018 book, Savage Kin, Indigenous Informants and American Anthropologists, received the inaugural Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award. And we are very honored and very pleased to be able to introduce her now. Take it away, Dr. Bruchac, and thank you very much for coming.
Kwai, greetings. Thank you for having me here. Let me just start sharing. Hold on one second here. There we go. So greetings. Today I speak to you from Nonotuck homelands along the Kwinitekw, better known as the Connecticut River. And in this place we call Indakina, all of the Northeast, our homeland. I offer thanks to all my relatives across time and space. Indigenous Native American history in the Northeast is deeply rooted, represented by more than 10,000 years of occupation over many, many generations. And so we begin with these land acknowledgements to recognize where we are. Today, my talk will focus on Native histories in the locale now occupied by the town of Northampton in the Connecticut River Valley. And this place and all of New England was known as Indakina, meaning homeland, but Northampton in particular is part of Nonotuck homeland. So Nonotuck homeland is very strictly situated on either side of the Kwinitekw, the Connecticut River, in between Bruchac and Agawam homelands. And the Nonotuck people had extensive relations with other Native nations across this region. So when I talk about Nonotuck, you can also extend some of that to shared experiences among these related tribal nations. Now, the Nonotuck territory encompasses the present-day towns of Amherst, Hadley, North Hadley, Hatfield, as well as Northampton. But the Nonotuck people did not live in isolation by any means. They participated in reciprocal trade and diplomacy with their closest Native neighbors, the Pecumtuck, Agawam, Orinoco, also with the Quabog in present-day central Massachusetts, the Agawam and Podunk to the south, the Orinoco to the west, and the Schaghticoke to the north. Now, many of these tribal names derive from indigenous terms that actually describe local topography. So, for example, the locative name Nonotuck, sometimes called Norwatuck, derives from Noatuck, signifying roughly in the midst of the river or the middle river, not meaning an island, but meaning a place that is centrally situated along the length of that long river. And it makes sense from a geographic perspective as well, because another suggested translation and another pronunciation of Nulwatog comes from the term faraway place from Nowat in the Massachusetts Wampanoag dialect, reflecting the language and perspective of Eastern Native peoples looking westward. Now, in thinking about this territory, it's hard to know where to start because so often our understandings of the Native past are shaped by not just colonial histories, but received memory that is passed down through colonial descendants. And so it can be difficult to see past those stereotypes, see through those records. And I like to say that I specialize in recovering these hidden histories. So accurate understandings of the past can be reconstructed if we look past colonial settlement, if we look past the scarcity of ethnographic information, and if we especially critically evaluate flawed representations. So indigenous lifeways along the Kwinitekw were inextricably entwined with technologically sophisticated and sustainable uses of local flora and fauna, including seasonal hunting and harvesting. Now here, let me emphasize technology as the ability to readily adapt available raw materials to make tools for hunting, fishing, planting, building canoes, constructing homes, weaving baskets, etc. Native people here hunted wild game, including bear, deer, moose, waterfowl, grouse, turtles, and many other species, especially anadromous shad and salmon. And fishing areas in this region were often shared by multiple Native nations. So it was not uncommon at the places with waterfalls where the fish would come upstream every year in the spring, and especially at places like Peskiomscut, unfortunately known today as Turner's Falls. It was not uncommon for multiple tribal nations to come together, and the soil itself retains evidence of that in terms of thick deposits with very high levels of carbon, calcium, and other byproducts of fish bones discarded over literally millennia. Now, native fields in this area were heavily forested and lands were forested, but fields and lands were not exactly wild. Native people actively managed the landscape by periodically burning over forest undergrowth to ease travel, improve visibility for hunting, and encourage the growth of berry bushes and young trees that would attract wildlife. In fact, during the early 1600s, English colonists in Northampton observed, quote, "The Indians had so often fired the forests in this country, especially pine, oak, and chestnut woods for the purpose of taking deer and wild game, that many large tracts were almost destitute of timber, in some places covered with high coarse grass." Now, the rich alluvial soils deposited by the rivers also provided a perfect environment for maize horticulture, which came along a few thousand years ago. Maize was typically interplanted in hills with several varieties of beans and squash, and these cultivated plants supplemented other indigenous foods that grew wild: nuts, acorns, walnuts, hickory nuts, chestnuts, berries, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, root vegetables, groundnuts, sunchoke, cattails, etc. And now I'm getting hungry, as well as numerous medicinal saps, leaves, flowers, roots, and barks. Now, during the early 1600s, Dutch and English colonial settlers were quite keen to settle this territory, and they established a series of small trading posts in native lands that they claimed and renamed as New Netherlands, Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Rhode Island Colony, among others, Connecticut Colony as well. Local historians later suggested that the native people in this river were very desirous that the English should settle among them, but that statement radically oversimplifies the complexity of intertribal and international relations. Because from a native perspective, in the early 1600s, the valley was still overwhelmingly native territory. And so we can tell from the records that Nonotuck and Agawam people thought it might be helpful to have a trading post in our territory. They really were not expecting an entire takeover. Now, I should also note something about tribal governance, because each tribal community throughout this Algonquian region that we now call New England was led by individuals who served in the roles of sachem or sagamore for male leaders, or sunksquaws for female leaders. These individuals were not great chiefs, as you might imagine, but heads of family bands, and each tribal nation had multiple sachems and sunksquaws. William Pynchon astutely summed up fluidity of these relations while noting, quote, "There are several small sachems in all near places. No one sachem doth rule all. And if one of these petty sachems hath made friendship with another, I believe they will stick no longer to him than the sun shines upon him." Today, we would call that voting with your feet. So native people were not so much governed by sachems as these sachems and sunksquaws were empowered to speak for and on behalf of the communities they lived in, and they were responsible too. Now, the early records, in fact, suggest that the Nonotuck community in particular was a force to be reckoned with. In 1648, William Pynchon, the most influential fur trader and land broker in the area, informed John Winthrop, "I grant the Indians are all within ye line of your patents, but you cannot say that therefore they are your subjects, nor yet within your jurisdiction until they have fully subjected themselves to your government, which I know they have not, and until you have bought their land. Until this be done, they must be esteemed as an independent free people, and so they of Nonotuck do all account themselves. And doubtless whichever goes with strength of men to disturb their peace at Nonotuck, they will take it for no other than a hostile action." Now, during the early years of colonization, when native people far outnumbered English colonists, dozens of native people were actually quite eager to engage in trade relations with William Pynchon, with his son John Pynchon, and with their sub-traders. Native people traded readily available corn, furs, and wampum for cloth, iron tools, beads, and even, although banned by colonial authorities, guns and ammunition. Now, to give you a sense of the extent of these relations, the sheer volume of personal names recorded in the colonial records proves that the native people in this region were not nameless and faceless others. Their names were documented in United Colonies records, Connecticut Colony records, New York colonial documents, the Pynchon account books, Northampton and Springfield court records, as well as the deeds for land transactions. The Pynchons themselves recorded the personal names of at least 230 individuals from Nonotuck and Agawam alone, and many of these appear in multiple documents with variant spellings or aliases. In Nonotuck alone, here is a list of some of those names. And I should note, by the way, that when people appear with variant spellings, it's because the English had a very difficult time transcribing native languages. And when they appear with variant names or aliases, it is because often native leaders would take different names at different moments in their lifespan, sometimes reflecting their status, sometimes reflecting their kinship relations. So in other words, Nonotuck Indians were quite well known to colonial settler neighbors. Some of the time, as shown in the surviving account books, these intercultural trade relations were quite useful to all participants. The Pynchons, however, also used these transactions to seduce native traders with alcohol or otherwise ensnare them in debt. For example, the Pecumtuck Sonsquaw Mashalisk, depicted here, was forced to sign away 2 parcels of her family land to pay off beaver debts. Those parcels included, quote, "Ye southerly side of the Cumtuck River, and so lying all along Connecticut River down to ye lower point of ye hill called Waquamps, for and in consideration of a debt of 10 large beavers and other debts of Woodawalunxon, her son, which she acknowledged herself engaged for the foresaid just and due debts, moreover, and in consideration of 60 fathom of wampum, 2 coats, some cotton, and other small things which Moshalisk acknowledged to have received." In 1660, the Nonotuck sachem Umpanchela was similarly forced to part with 2 tracts of riverland at Nottacus and Wequiatog in order to pay off a debt to John Pynchon that included a fine of 2 fathoms of wampum for being drunk. Now, when these paper documents were transacted, it's crucial to note that they are not deeds as we think of them today. They are more appropriately seen as shared use agreements rather than quit claims. Because in these documents, and granted, Native people are not writing them, but they are speaking their intentions, Native leaders are clearly attempting to preserve, in written words, Indigenous cartographies and rights while outlining the complex kin relations that preserved hereditary rights to certain areas. And in many cases, the Native signatories received objects called gifts that in a Native perspective would more appropriately be considered tributary gifts more than payments, especially given that the documents often explicitly reserved traditional hunting, harvesting, gathering, and planting rights. And as you can see from this map, none of the key shared fishing areas at the falls, like Holyoke and Peskamscut, were ever transcribed in any deed. They were never in any way sold. Now, for example, the very first deed transacted with William Pynchon in the Valley on July 15th, 1636, was signed by 13 Native people, including Kamakamantanchan, who were identified as ancient Indians of Agawam, and Katonas, who signed in the name of his mother, Kiwanusk the Tamasham, and Tamasham is another word for a female leader, a Sunksqua. He also signed for Niaram, the wife of Koa. The Native signatories received 18 fathoms of wampum, 18 coats, 18 hatchets, 18 hoes, and 18 knives. And as I note, these were often considered tributary gifts, especially because one was given to each. And the document explicitly reserved hunting and fishing rights, but it also indicated that damages would be due if English hogs or cattle were to disturb Native crops. Another deed in 1663, signed by 3 Nonotuck sachems, Chickwalloppe, Umpanchela, and Concon, conveyed lands on the east side of the river in present-day Hadley and parts of Amherst, Belchertown, Pelham, and Shutesbury, in exchange for 220 fathoms of wampum, which is quite a large sum. That's enough to make at least 20 small wampum belts or several very large wampum belts. Now, this particular deed reserved use rights for the land sold, but it also suggested the hope of neighborly relations. Ye Indians aforenamed, and in particular Concont, doth reserve and keep one cornfield, and also they reserve liberty to hunt deer, fowl, etc., and to take fish, beaver, or otter, etc. The Indians desired they might set their wigwams at sometimes within ye tract of ground they sold without offense, and that the English would be kind and neighborly to them, and not prohibiting them firewood out of ye woods, etc., which was promised them. Now, this language sounds very agreeable, but of course it did not quite work out that way. Since the Pynchons were not fully fluent in Algonquian or any Algonquian language, they needed Native interpreters whenever they negotiated these deeds. Some of the witnesses held proprietary interests in the lands held. Others were translators and negotiators, but we really can't trust that they accurately interpreted rights, agreements, topography, or even relationships. And there are some cases where Native people signed for lands they did not actually live in or have control over, but perhaps were seduced or paid to do so. And as time went on, it became abundantly clear that the English settlers had no intention of honoring these shared use agreements. Now, this explains why, as English settlements expanded and as more colonists came in, Native people felt the need to begin constructing some fortified locales for caching supplies and conducting diplomacy. The Nonotuck community constructed several elevated forts during the mid-1600s. One was at Fort Plain on a high bank above the Manhan River in present-day Easthampton. One, also named Fort Plain, was on a high bank of the Connecticut River between Northampton and Hatfield. One was on the west side of Lawrence's Plain atop a steep bank at the east boundary of Fort Meadows skirts. And in 1664, the Nonotuck petitioned the town meeting of Northampton for permission to build a fort right across the Mill River from the fledgling English settlement at a site now called Fort Hill off of South Street. The problem, however, with living close to the English is that Native people residing at the fort or even passing through the fort were compelled to comply with conditions imposed by the town that included the following restrictions. They couldn't break the Sabbath by working or gaming. They couldn't powwow, meaning they couldn't bring people together for spiritual or religious ceremonies or healing ceremonies. They couldn't get liquor or cider. That's probably a good thing, so they wouldn't get drunk. But they couldn't take in Indians of other places. And this really wreaked havoc with any attempt to conduct diplomacy. As the years passed, the Nonotuck grew tired of living under English laws, and the English grew far less tolerant of their native neighbors. By 1670, the town selectmen were demanding that Nonotuck people vacate the fort. Now, increasing pressures from colonial settlers led to conflicts over land and the outbreak of war across all of the New England colonies. The Wampanoag Sachem Metacom from southeastern New England blamed the English in Plymouth colony for provoking this war by pressuring Native people to sell land, cheating them in bargains, crowding them out of their traditional territories, failing to honor agreements, and tricking them into drunkenness. And when the war broke out, the Nonotuck vacated their fort and joined forces with Nipmuc, Narragansett, Wampanoag, and other warriors. As hostilities increased, Native people started moving to other locales and folding in with other communities. And the Pecumtuck community just to the north offered the falls at Peskiumscut, one of those traditional fishing places, as a place of refuge for Native non-combatants. And so in late spring of 1676, in the midst of the war, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, and women, children, and elderly from other Native nations were camped at this site to partake of the annual shad and salmon migrations. But this peaceful refuge became a site of tragedy on May 19th of that year, when roughly 300 Native women, children, and elderly were slaughtered by Captain William Turner's company of volunteers from the town of Northampton. Roughly 40 of the English force, including Turner, were killed during the retreat. And the place that used to be known as Peskiumscut, the place of the split rock, a place of peace for fishing, became named Turner's Falls. Now, over the course of the war, the bloodiest conflict per capita in American history, dwellings all across the colonies were vacated. 52 English towns in Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Rhode Island, and Connecticut were attacked. More than 2,500 colonists were killed, roughly 30% of the English population. Native casualties, including many non-combatants, numbered at least 5,000. And at least 1,000 of those were peaceful Nipmuc Indians interned on Deer Island, where they starved or froze to death. These hostilities resulted in the temporary abandonment of both Native and English settlements across central and southern New England. By the war's end, the surviving Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people returned to their original homelands in eastern and southern New England, but most of the Native people from the Connecticut River Valley chose to relocate. Nonotuck, Bacumtuck, Agawam, Orinoco, and Schaghticoke people then folded into other communities in diaspora, causing considerable confusion about regional tribal identities, and that confusion persists to the present day. Some folded into Abenaki enclaves in present-day Vermont and New Hampshire. Others accepted the invitation of New York Governor Edmund Andros to move to a new refugee village established at Schaghticoke in Mohican territory. And here I should note another point of confusion. This Schaghticoke was separate from the Mohican Schaghticoke village in western Massachusetts on the Upper Housatonic, and it was also separate from the Schaghticoke tribal nation in Connecticut on the Lower Housatonic River. But all three names are locative terms in Algonquian, which simply derive from the Algonquian word piscottigoch, meaning where waters come together, noting a place where two or more rivers combine. Now, after these diasporic movements, John Pynchon, William Pynchon's son, who was then the leading not only land broker and fur trader, but politician and magistrate in the valley, Pynchon started arguing that all Indians living north of Springfield, Massachusetts, should be considered hostiles. When he requested military assistance from London, he portrayed the valley's native communities as thieves and murderers, claiming, if at any time they have given assistance to us and been instrumental to destroy our enemies, it had not been out of any principle of friendship or obedience, for at other times they have been ready to assist our adversaries and destroy us. Sometimes they dwell at Schaghticoke, sometimes at the eastward and make marriages with the eastern Indians, and sometimes at Canada, and live like beasts and birds of prey upon the destruction of others. Now, native movements were rarely as confusing or sinister as Pynchon suggests, given that fluid social boundaries and political relations had long been common practice across the region. And I sometimes like to make the point that when you look at this diaspora map, if you want to understand the movements of Native people during the subsequent French and Indian Wars that continue into the 1760s, you have only to turn these arrows in reverse. And you'll then understand why Northern Mohawk living at the Catholic mission villages of Ganawake and Ganasatake would join forces with Abenaki living at the mission villages of Woolanak and Odanak, and Huron-Wendat living at the mission village of Wendake, because these people found common cause with people from the southern parts of New England who had been forced out of their territory. And of course, there is much intermarriage among these diasporic communities. Now, Native people were also held to a much higher standard of conduct than their English neighbors. English justice was unpredictable. Those who lived close by English settlements were routinely hauled into colonial courts to answer for charges of theft, trespass, property destruction, assault, damages, and other crimes, whether or not they were guilty. And when colonial authorities heard their cases, Native defendants who lost their cases, either through an inability to fluently speak English or an inability to explain their presence in a place where something had happened, they might be forced into debt, they might be sold into involuntary servitude, or just condemned to execution. As a case in point, in October of 1696, 4 Nonotuck men, Pemaquanzit, who was a relative of the Nonotuck sachem Umpanchela, Wenapuk, Makwalos, and Wawanes, who were then living in Hatfield, were arrested for the murder of Richard Church of Hadley, who was out hunting in what was still considered Nonotuck territory. The 4 Native men were interrogated and tried in the Northampton court, and the Nonotuck families living in Hatfield were captured and brought to the court and forced to bear witness. This, by the way, is Samuel Partridge's account of why the 2 younger men should be set free. After the trial, which took several days, the younger men were jailed, but the 2 older men, Makwalos and Mawanes, were found guilty and publicly executed by gunshot on October 23rd, 1696. They were the first people executed by an English court in Western Massachusetts. But in the wake of these executions, the Sachems at Schaghticoke, where many of these people had kin, told New York Governor Benjamin Fletcher that all 4 men were innocent. The English search party had, in fact, lost track of the actual culprits, misidentified the suspects who happened to be hunting in the same region, and then tortured and whipped the 2 young men to extract confessions from them. He also provided evidence that another native man had actually committed the murder. But since 2 were dead and 2 were not, the English courts decided the matter was settled. Making matters worse, in 1694, the General Court of Massachusetts passed a declaration to encourage colonial soldiers and volunteers by paying bounties for every Indian, great or small, which they shall kill or take and bring in prisoner, the sum of 50 pounds per head. The scalp bounties were periodically renewed, and by 1704 had been adjusted to 100 pounds for native men or youths capable of bearing arms, 10 pounds for a woman or child above 10 years of age, and children under 10 could be kept and claimed as prisoners to keep, sell, or transport. In effect, any native person living within 5 miles east or west of the Connecticut River was considered a hostile enemy combatant and could be shot and scalped on sight. I will spare you a recounting of the many conflicts that ensued during the so-called French and Indian Wars, but suffice to say that most of the Agawam, Nonotuck, Tecumseh, Orinoco, and Schaghticoke people left the valley. But some people remained hiding in plain sight. Now, during the 18th and 19th centuries, Native people in New England often preferred to live in forested locales or at the edges of white towns. In Northampton, the native settlement was described as, quote, the end of the trail for the last Native Americans whose ancestors roamed the forests and fished the streams. Only 7 or 8 houses were located there, devoid of elegance or comfort, occupied by persons noticeable for their peculiarities, habits, and dress. Now, in Amherst and Hadley, there were a number of forest camps, and Sylvester Judd described Nonotuck people who made baskets and brooms and hunted. They were known by name, they were familiar. There were basket makers, Nonotuck women who peddled brooms and baskets on a regular route coming to English towns. There were also friendships between some of these native families and some of these English families, despite all the bloodshed that had passed. Because native people, when they were traveling, could readily transform natural resources harvested along their travels into products they could sell or barter for other supplies. They marketed baskets and brooms, hired out as day labor, and dispensed traditional native medicine to their white neighbors while continually tracing long-standing intertribal connections, kinship networks, and familiar trails. Now, novelists often reveled in depicting these people as the last of their kind. It's interesting to read some of those obituaries because often a native person described as the last of their tribe who dies, there is a notation that their funeral is attended by their siblings, their children, their nephews, their cousins, but they are somehow regarded as the last. This was a fiction, but it was very popular fiction. In her semi-fictional book, Old Town Folks, for example, novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe suggested that the entire Nipmuc Nation had dwindled to a few scattered families living a wandering life on the outskirts of the thrift and civilization of the whites. And yet she also described respectable families who owned comfortable farms and came to meeting in their farm wagons. Native people were at all spectrums of the social economy. Now, in reality, virtually every aspect of Yankee life in the 1830s, from the food being grown in the fields, to the brooms used to sweep the floors, to the rush seats of chairs, to the baskets that held farm products, many of these things reflected native resources and often native culture. But even so, little attention was paid to the innate skill and artistry of the native people who made these objects or provided these services. Most native-made baskets and brooms were regarded as utilitarian items that, when they outwore their usefulness, might simply be used for fire starters. Every now and then, if baskets were fancy, and there are actually more of these now being found in museums and private collections, when baskets were painted, stamped, decorated, or sometimes signed, like these baskets at historic Northampton, they were far more likely to be preserved. But often the stories of the people who made them were not kept. Now, one of the more interesting native artifacts that survives from the 1800s is a brown leather portfolio at Memorial Libraries in Deerfield, Massachusetts. It holds approximately 900 specimens of indigenous medicinal plants compiled by Dr. Stephen West Williams, who met with an Abenaki Indian doctor named Louis Watso. He described, for example, quote, "Wild ginger, snake root, is useful in the low stages of fevers, in nervous palpitations and similar complaints. When a company of Indians were in Deerfield in the year 1837, I was much affected with palpitation of the heart, and they were much offended with me because I would not take their preparation, which contained a large proportion of this snake root." In other words, Williams wanted their knowledge, but he didn't necessarily want to interact with them or trust them. But here I should note that using this image to give you a sense of what this group of traveling Indians might have looked like, Watso and his family were not strangers who simply happened to be wandering through. They were frequent visitors and fond friends to many folks in Deerfield. But Dr. Williams complained, quote, "With all our improvements, the tendency of the times is downwards instead of upwards. The mass of people believe more in Indian doctors than in regular physicians. Within a year or two, I have seen hundreds of my fellow citizens chasing after the Indians who came here to make us a visit for the cure of their diseases." So in other words, Williams, who was an allopathic doctor using the modern remedies of mercury and purgatives and poisons and odd medical cures that were common in the 19th century, didn't like the competition from native herb doctors. Now, in their own oral traditions, native families recalled the 19th century as a time when they freely traveled, but they were not welcome guests in every town. And Northampton, sadly, was not a particularly welcome place to come. The same group that visited Deerfield came to Northampton the following year, and they were reported on by the Northampton Courier and other newspapers in this way. "Strange how demoralizing the contact of civilization with that of savage life. They're a slothful, ragged, dirty, squalid race, appearing to have adopted the vices of the whites without seeming to emulate any of their virtues. The lofty bearing and noble demeanor of the primitive Indians are gone, and nothing is left but the abject and debased exterior of the red man. They employ themselves in manufacturing baskets, their habitations are miserable tents, and their clothing the fragments of the cast-off wardrobes of white men. Altogether considered, they are merely a wretched remnant of a race of noble and proud red men who once tenanted this fair valley, and whose stealthy tread and uplifted tomahawk carried death to hearts terrified by their appalling war cry." And I read this to you just to make the point that I think people had been reading a little too much fiction and indulging a little too much in a romantic fantasy that the only real Indian is a savage Indian, and failed to acknowledge that Native people could in fact adopt whatever clothing, whatever language, whatever activities they chose and still be regarded as Native, and were not simply doomed to exist only in the past. Now, another Native healer who was warmly received in the region was a woman named Rhoda Rhodes. She was Mohican, who lived in a small wood frame house in Indian Hollow. She traveled to Northampton, Westfield, and Springfield on a regular basis. An 1871 article in the Hampshire Gazette quoted one old fellow who recalled that Rhoda, quote, "was very kind to children, and her maple sugar box was emptied oftener by the lumps she gave us than any other manner. Old Rhoda was a doctress and dealt in roots and herbs and understood what she was dealing in much better than many of our modern doctors." And I have found this again and again and again, that Indian doctors and doctresses were regarded as not only more effective and more accomplished in healing remedies, but were more willing to barter, to exchange goods, to do whatever was necessary, and often to do their healing work for free, whereas white doctors insisted on payment and poisoning, I should say. Now, the printer Homer Merriam recalled staying with Rhoda in the 1830s. He recalled that the visitors, of which there were sometimes several, slept in her attic, which was divided into bedrooms. And he recalled, in a sort of desperation, I decided to try the skills of an Indian doctress. I went to see her and remained with her several months. She was 80 years old or more, had a son of perhaps 50 who was her factotum, gathered roots and herbs for her and prepared them into medicine. She was, I believe, pure Indian, had a good knowledge of roots and herbs and their medicinal properties, and a good degree of skill in the use of them, and quite a reputation in the country round, and the name of having cured or helped a good many sick people. He wrote extensively about her, as did a number of people who knew her, and yet she's virtually unknown to many people today. Now, in Northampton, perhaps the best known native family were the Mamanashes, and Sally Mamanash is buried in Bridge Street Cemetery in the Clapp family plot. Her gravestone reads, quote, Sally Mamanash, the last of the Indians here, a niece of Agawam, a Christian, died in the family of Warren and Sophia Clapp, 1853, aged 88. And hold on 1 second. I have a needy kitty.
I'm just going to take this moment while we're waiting for Dr. Bruchac to come back to say, if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Now, in the 1740s, Sally's father, Joseph Mamanash, like many other native men in New England, mustered in alongside his white neighbors for military service. In 1745, he joined Nathan Whiting's 11th Company, along with Mohegan men from the Uncas, Dick, Nanapaw, Quaquaquit, and Wittawamp families. And he also shows up on a muster roll in 1756. Her brother, Joseph Mamanash, joined Daniel Shay's regiment during the American Revolution, but neither of these native veterans are recognized in any location in historic Northampton. By 1779, all of Sally's relatives were dead. Her father and brother were buried near present-day Hospital Hill. Her mother, Elizabeth Agawam, who was sister of the famous Mohegan minister Samson Agawam, died at the age of 60, having been stoned to death by a gang of Northampton boys. Now, these losses likely explain Sally's decision to take refuge by joining the church and living with a white family. And this diorama at the Pequot Museum is the best image I can give you to give you a sense of what her life was like and what she may have looked like in this time. Sophia and Warren Clapp welcomed Sally into their home situated on South Street, literally next to the site of the old Nonotuck fort. There, she could be close to the old trails and territories, close to the old corn planting fields, close to her relatives' grave sites, and close to town. And Northampton at that time was not a very large community. Now, articles in the Daily Hampshire Gazette described Sally as an itinerant spinner and weaver who had somehow been magically transformed into a sweet, saintly Christian. But there is so much more to her story. Her time living in Northampton overlapped with the lives of Black activists like Sojourner Truth and David Ruggles. We know that Sally read the Bible, but we also know that she owned a trunk full of books. Did she read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Did she read Old Town Folks? Did she read Sojourner Truth's published memorandum? Only 3 artifacts associated with Sally survive today. Her Bible, stored at Forbes Library, her favorite chair, now at Historic Northampton, and her gravestone. And incidentally, when I went through the Bible in detail, I noticed that the pages that were the most heavily worn were the ones that talked about the evils visited upon so-called Christians who failed to conduct themselves in a kindly manner towards their neighbors. And I like to think about what it must have been like for Sally to be reading that aloud in some of the families where she went to do weaving. Now, by the late 1800s, Northampton's residents simply refused to see the text in those old Indian deeds, the cornfields and the meadows, the graves above Pancake Plain, the basket makers on their streets, or the houses on the edge of the river as evidence of Nonotuck persistence. Instead, like so many other towns in New England, local historians actively re-scripted local histories to write living Indians out of the picture. That erasure still haunts us today. And now for a brief discussion of the process of searching for artifacts and collecting the dead. During the salvage anthropology era of the late 1800s and early 1900s, the trope of the vanishing Indian dominated historical, archaeological, and museological representations. Local historians and archaeologists rushed to locate and excavate native habitation sites, such as bark wigwams shown here, graveyards, maize fields, and forts, and assert themselves as experts on Indian histories, even though they expressed little to no interest in speaking with living Native people. And as McGregor notes here, digging up relics of Indian craftsmanship is a favorite pastime of outdoor collectors. Sometimes a trophy worth hours of work turns up a war or hunting arrow, a wampum bead, and for the very lucky, a pipe bowl. Amateur and professionals, collectors excavated native sites in ways that were imprecise at best, scattered at worst. At the height of the collecting frenzy from the 1860s through the 1940s, roughly 400 sets of human skeletal remains and nearly 50,000 artifacts, all native, were unearthed from a 50-mile stretch of the Connecticut River between Northfield and Springfield. These native objects were routinely sorted, labeled, and stored, following logics that reflected the interests of the collectors more than the intentions of the indigenous. So, for example, in 1928, a farmer in North Hadley discovered a cache of 300 spearheads from 2 to 6 inches in length. It would have looked much like this. Caches like these were highly significant to Native people. They were exchanged among kin, clan leaders, or elders to create or strengthen political alliances, and they were stored underground in configurations like this, which is at the Institute for American Indian Studies, where they could be pulled out and used to make other tools. These leaf blades could then be chipped into arrowheads, knives, and whatever kind of tool was needed. And yet, these indigenous assemblages were assumed by collectors to have been devoid of order, and they were rarely displayed as they were found. Warren Moorhead of the Robert Peabody Museum at Andover dictated that native blades and projectile points must be reconfigured into artistic shapes for display, arrayed in rows, circles, or other artistic configurations according to the fancy of the collector to facilitate better study of their forms, which of course tells us nothing about their actual use. Now, the most influential collectors in the Valley, Professors Edward Hitchcock Jr. of Amherst College and Harris Hawthorne Wilder of Smith College, made virtually no attempt to collect ethnographic information from living Native people. Instead, they focused exclusively and fetishistically on the skeletal remains of dead Indians. Their exhibits, in fact, promoted the belief that the native dead were scientific specimens who simply did not warrant the same protection as white burials. When Wilder and his wife Inez Whipple Wilder founded the Anthropological and Zoological Museum at Smith College, they cataloged roughly 1,000 entries, including 40 sets of native remains from various locales in the region. These native bodies on display were conceptually separated from any notion of living society and situated in the past. The magical effects of this human taxidermy made the dead seem tangibly present, as though testifying to their own extinction. Now, lest you think I am overstating the case, the Daily Hampshire Gazette described the plaster reconstructions of native heads on display as, quote, all that remains of the peaceful agricultural Nonotuck Indians who have long since been replaced by the citizens of Hampshire County. And in the late 1990s, when I was a student at Smith College professors casually referred to those displays as trophy cabinets, conveying, even if only ironically, the legacy of white conquest. Now, Wilder was inspired by Hitchcock at Amherst, who founded the Gilbert Museum of Indian Relics in the 1860s while amassing more than 35,000 native objects. And in his personal correspondence, Hitchcock expressed no interest whatsoever in the emerging field of ethnography, although he was aware of social concerns. In 1904, for example, he wrote to Wilder to decline an invitation to an excavation because, quote, a big missionary person is coming to the college, and my academic duties compel me to be looking after the work of the perishing living savages rather than to look for more craniae of the dead ones. Now, Hitchcock accepted whatever Indian relics faculty and alumni were willing to send him in whatever condition. He claimed his curation practices to be state-of-the-art, since his catalog recorded the locality, shape, structure, and composition of each specimen, and yet his information is full of holes because the objects had so little contextual information that it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to reassociate funerary objects with the individuals they were buried with. And often he would write on these objects, Indian grave, Indian tools, buried with an Indian. Now, the Wilder collections were relatively well documented with maps, stratigraphy, measurements, and photographs. Wilder also consulted with local historians like Harry Andrew Wright and used the evidence in colonial era deeds and papers to seek out specific known sites and specific individuals. The sites excavated by Wilder and his colleagues were not random finds, but were identifiable, although often unmarked, native cemeteries. For example, in 1905, Wilder and his brother-in-law, Ralph Wheaton Whipple, discovered a site in the midst of L.P. Bullard's tobacco field in North Hadley, quote, the traditional site of the Nonotuck chief Konkon, whose name appears on several of the deeds for the meadowland, sold to that shrewd English trader from Springfield, John Pynchon. A deed mentions his widow, Sarah Konkon, a son, Pacummahouse, and a daughter, Majesset, with others who lived at the site, and undoubtedly the village had numerous inhabitants. Wilder excavated a number of graves and boxed up the remains using the new, quote, intact excavation, end quote, method they had devised for transport to Smith. Wilder regarded all of his excavations as face-to-face encounters, going so far as to list his skeletal collections as, quote, dead Indians I have known, end quote. In 1917, for example, he told Clark Whistler at the American Museum of Natural History, I have just finished the preparation of a beautiful Aboriginal skeleton of local origin, a young woman of the Pecumtucks between Deerfield and Greenfield, Mass. I removed the entire grave, earth and all, and no bone has been disturbed from its original position. This assertion that no bone was disturbed is patently false. Every bone of that woman was removed from her grave and boxed up for transport to Smith College, where other young women would then handle her remains. Now, Hitchcock and Wilder were both committed to the practice of physical anthropology, which included developing and testing emerging theories about the correlations among bodily shape, race, intelligence, and social fitness. Wilder made plaster casts and models. These are plaster skulls and plaster casts. And he measured the craniometric measurements of skulls in multiple collections. And the data collected from these measurements directly fed into the growing national interest in racial typology during the emergence of the American eugenics movement by providing theoretically scientific explanations for the limited intelligence and social status of people of color. Wilder was considered a pioneer in forensic reconstruction but his techniques focused on aesthetics more than accuracy and on the presumption that white skulls were somehow superior, which of course is patently false. Now, Wilder's collection, which was originally exhibited in a glass case at the Sabin Reed Science Center, featured the skeletal remains of ape, African, Native American, Asian, and European individuals arranged in relative order of comparative development, tutoring students to see the physical evidence of supposed racial disparities. One photograph of a dig site that was still on display in the late 1990s noted that, quote, many students participated in the Wilder's research, helping to excavate Indian bones from Aboriginal cemeteries disturbed by construction crews. But consider the fraught power relations involved. The assumption was that construction crews and college professors and students were somehow entitled to disturb and collect remains from Native cemeteries, while white cemeteries in the same time period were treated as inviolable and sacred places. And I'll close with part 4. In 1906, the U.S. Antiquities Act classified Native American remains and artifacts as the property of the U.S. government. In 1990, that classification shifted dramatically with the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which required all museums, including Smith College, to assess, report, and potentially repatriate any Native human remains, sacred objects, patrimonial objects, or funerary objects in their collections. Now, the legislation was founded on the premise that somehow Native grave lots have remained intact in collections, and yet on a practical level, many of the assemblages from these grave sites in the region had been dispersed into different storage areas and different departments, if not different towns and museums. And in some cases, skulls went to one museum, body parts went to another, funerary objects went somewhere else, and the field notes were archived in yet another location. So during the 1960s to 70s, most of those remains were removed from Smith College and Amherst College and deaccessioned to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. During the late 1990s and into the 2000s, faculty and administrators at Amherst, Smith, Mount Holyoke, and UMass agreed to collaborate in joint consultation and research towards NAGPRA compliance. A team of UMass faculty and graduate students then methodically re-inventoried the remains, reassembled the bodies, retraced the evidence in field notes, all while initiating consultation with all of the related tribal nations. The 5-college repatriation committee then spent more than a decade in consultation with Abenaki, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Stockbridge Mohican tribal repatriation representatives before finally reaching an agreement on repatriation. By 2017, all of the Pecumtuck, Nonotuck, Sachems, Waranoco, and other local Native remains who had been disinterred by the colleges had been peacefully reburied in places where they should, we hope, be safe from further disturbance. And those sites, by the way, are not public knowledge. But our responsibilities do not end there. The Vanishing Act that was served up by local historians and scientists included both physical and intellectual dispossessions, couched in historical misdirection that, in effect, recolonized Native people, living and dead. For generations, the displays at both Smith and Amherst thus had the effect of situating real Native people inescapably in the past. Museum audiences, including impressionable students, were trained to draw their understandings of Native history not from any indigenous context and not from a living community, but from the theories in effect at the moment of excavation, the opinions of scientific experts and curators, the artifacts on display, the text on the display card, the colonial records, and other fraught sources. And so in my own work, I specialize in what I call restorative methodologies. And these are just a few of the approaches. Restorative methodologies require far more than merely recombining collections to achieve some semblance of their original context. We must also attend to the process by which these objects and human remains were disconnected. Extensive surveys of museum records, reconstructing the correspondence of collectors, collating data from different collections, and situating the relations not only of the objects to their origins and their communities, but of the collectors who engaged in a lot of trade and exchange. And by doing so, we can start to realize how particular ideologies in the museum process came to categorize some people as collectors and others as collected, some as specimens and some as humans. And as the efforts of multiple institutions and tribal nations in recent decades illustrate, there is enormous healing potential in processes of cultural recovery and reconciliation, which are not easy, but must be done. And so, in this valley, regional scholars and indigenous communities have been methodically and critically assessing colonial documents, town histories, and material collections. In many cases, seemingly unknown Native histories can be recovered by revisiting Native landscapes, by consulting with living Native communities, and by dismantling those romantic stereotypes that push Native people into the vanished past. Historians and archaeologists are increasingly compelled to work with the living, to collaborate with Native people as active partners in the identification and curation of both older collections and newly discovered sites, while still protecting some sites that have not yet been disturbed. Regional cooperation among museums, Native tribes, and collectors is essential because so many parties hold different parts of the puzzle. And in some cases, the landscape itself remembers, especially in the areas that are still densely planted with corn, especially in the meadows and swamps that are still full of the same rich resources that once sustained Native communities. And so in sum, these few examples of Nonotuck history in Northampton are here to offer illuminating glimpses into the extensive networks of Native people who persisted despite colonial erasure. Many Native descendants who are still living in New England, and even a few in this valley, retain oral histories and material evidence of this persistence. And so everywhere, in museums, in universities, in conferences, we are looking back in order to look forward. We are recognizing the persistence of Native people and Native homelands, even for Native people living in diaspora. We need to collectively and critically reassess the past, just as Bridgewater University did in 2020, by bringing together a large cohort of Native and non-Native scholars to reconsider and evaluate the impact of colonial histories on Native lives, past and present. And so, in closing, let me offer condolences for the Nonotuck who were forced to leave, while also offering gratitude to the many Native nations who took them in. I acknowledge in particular the Nipmuc to the east, the Wampanoag and Narragansett to the southeast, the Mohegan, Pequot, and Schaghticoke to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north, among many others. Recognizing that the entirety of the North American continent constitutes indigenous homelands, I respect the sovereignty of these and hundreds of other Native nations that survive today. Kutsiolioni. Thank you.
Wow, Marge. Excuse me, Dr. Bruchac. I'm blown away. I'm absolutely blown away. And I know I'm not the only one because you've been receiving kudos from many people during this lecture. just to tell you a bit about what we've been seeing, there's a message here for you from Lori Weinstein, who says, "Hi, Marge, Lori Weinstein here. What are some of the sources that discuss the movements of natives after the King Philip War and then returned to the Connecticut Valley? Lucy and I are trying to follow some of the families that were moving back and forth." So I'm sure you know who that is and what's that about.
I do. And there is, of course, there is no one single source, and I'm happy to share materials with Lucy and Lori anytime. And
Yep.
ironically, one of the most useful sources is actually Gordon Day's work on the St. Francis Abenaki. And we need more of that kind of work, because what Day did in the 1970s and 80s was to try to track particular family names and where they traveled to. And what's interesting with a question like that is that, well, let's go back here for a second, is that many of these names they change over time. And one of the ironies is that in the colonial era, people might have several names, but only one name sticks. And then by the 1800s and 1900s, Native people might take on the name of a previous ancestor or take on English names. So often the biggest challenge is genealogical. And so to do that kind of work, it's actually best to work with tribal nations. And in many cases, as many people will know, tribal rosters and genealogies are not publicly available. And in many cases, they're very private and very privately kept. But that can be one way to start. And I'm happy to share with them some other academic sources later on. So here's just a quick answer to that.
Oh, terrific. Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
We have another question. Could the name Nonotuck refer to the island of land that used to be in the Connecticut River before the river changed course, positively identifying the place more accurately than at the midpoint of the river?
No, because it doesn't refer to an island. Many people used to think that, some historians suggested that, but linguistically, it is not about an island, it is about a region. So in the midst of the river is a broad geographic region and not just one little place. And especially because the river over time has meandered. Northampton has a very dramatic oxbow. So the river's meandered constantly. So even the shapes of the islands come and go and come and go. Shepherd's Island, for example, was not there for a very long time, but now is present, and every now and then it disappears. So, yeah.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question, is there any evidence of English who felt positively about the native people? Was there any working together between English and natives in the early times or during the search for Indian relics?
During the search for Indian relics, that's not so much. In early times, yes, to a degree, and that's where the Pynchons are such a tragic case, because the language in those deeds is so, I almost say beautiful in places where it articulates kinship networks, it articulates who is living in which territory and how they know that territory. It articulates these family relations and what activities people are pursuing there. And I love that Hadley deed where it says, we hope for neighborly relations. But it's heartbreaking to me that those documents and understandings were so effective for the first 10 to 30 years that enabled everyone to live peacefully. And when things broke apart, it was devastating. And it literally fractured because the English refused to acknowledge the understandings that were in the very same deeds they transacted. And because when new colonists came over, they demanded more land. So, for instance, the tragedy of Vermont and New Hampshire is that even though Abenaki people in the north, including my nation, the Mohegan Abenaki, were very clear about policing boundaries, it was the sons and grandsons of colonists who insisted on taking more land, and the scalp bounties are part of what helped them to do it. Wow. So one of the more tragic cases is that Caleb Lyman in Northampton in the early 1700s wanted to make some extra money, so he went north, found a family of Coos people on the Connecticut River, slaughtered 7 of them in their wigwam, and then brought the scalps to Boston for the bounty. And so bounties, scalp bounties, are an entire study in and of themselves. So the point, that's part of why I use that story from 1696 of that hunting incident, because that became the moment, not just King Philip's War in the 1670s, but the fact that in the 1690s, when Native people who had left tried to come back, they were seen as hostile invaders rather than people who had left their homes coming back to their homes. And they were treated like hostile invaders. And all of the Massachusetts colonial dictates that came down, including the ones dictated by John Pynchon himself, just reinforced that idea.
Wow.
So yes, there are some positive stories. I just haven't shared many of them here. So,
Well, at least we know there were a few. That's good.
mhm.
Okay, so with so many tribal groups not recognized, how were the bodies returned to the tribal groups?
Oh, it was a joint repatriation. So in the Connecticut River Valley, Abenaki, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Stockbridge Mohican finally agreed to jointly claim and jointly repatriate and jointly rebury. So instead of taking them somewhere else, they were reburied in the valley, not in the locations they came from, but in a safe place.
Great. Well, I have to give a shout out to Joshua Hoffman because he says, thank you from Japan. Your insights were helpful in the work he's doing locally in rural Japan as an
Cool.
expat and Berkshire resident. So I thought you'd like to know that.
Okay.
That's he wins being the furthest away. So another question, did Native Americans have a written language? And if so, did they leave manuscripts behind?
So the language was oral until the 1600s, really until the 1500s. So when it became written, it was first recorded for the most part by missionaries. So for example, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag languages were first written down by John Eliot and other missionaries. In fact, one of the first books published in the colonies was the Bible in the quote unquote Massachusetts dialect. But the Massachusetts language that John Eliot used was provided by a variety of Native informants. And every European recorder who tried to write a Native language did it based on their own home language, their own hearing, and their own orthography. So that's why the same word or name can appear in multiple variants, and it can be extraordinarily confusing. It's also the reason why we're not doing closed captioning.
Right.
Because I have learned the hard way that many Native words come out as curse words in closed captioning and end up with really absurd statements that I would never have coming out of my mouth, but that's what it sounds like to the device that hears it. So the written language only came about through colonial contact. And that's why even today, Native linguists, so for example, I'll give a call out here to Jessie Littledoe-Baird, who has been instrumental in recovering the spoken Wampanoag language by backtracing the words in Eliot's Bible, by backtracing the communities and the people that he consulted with, and then by bringing the language alive again in the Wampanoag community among Wampanoag speakers. So it's a long-winded answer, but the quick answer is no, written languages did not exist before European contact, unless you consider tattoos and markings on trees and petroglyphs a language, in which case, yes, there are symbolic languages, and there are gestural languages, and there are performative languages, the way you dress and the way you interact. But written language is a result of colonization.
Very interesting. I like your expanded answer about the other types of languages. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And dance too, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, there are a couple of questions about the scalp bounties. Do you mind answering those?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
so one is, how long did the scalp bounties last? And another related one is, have any of the scalps been preserved?
Ooh, I don't know. I honestly don't know if any have been preserved. So I'm just pulling up some of my notes here. So the 1694 General Court of Massachusetts Declaration is the one that I read to you. Those were renewed often on a yearly basis. They were periodically adjusted, and they were often expanded. And in some cases, I mean, this is the crazy thing about scalps, is that scalping was to a degree practiced by Native people, but it was expanded dramatically by colonists as a monetary incentive for decimating Native populations. And so they're actually, let's see if I can locate it here. Let's see. So at one point by 1757, the bounty in present-day Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts, had been raised to 300 pounds per scalp.
Wow.
And I can't really give you an equivalent in today's money, but 300 pounds in 1757 is probably equivalent to at least $3,000 today. And in some cases, the scalp bounty was either a little more or very close to the price for bringing in a live prisoner. So it was often more expedient to simply kill someone and take their scalp. And one of the strange things about scalp bounties is that there were prohibitions against fake scalps. So you were not supposed to be scalping other European colonists, but you really couldn't tell who was who once the head was gone and only part of the head was part of the skull, the scalp was left. So it's not a pretty topic, but there is, I'll locate it. There is a source that I just located that's a dissertation on scalp bounties that gives you the details. So I will locate that and put the link in the chat.
Okay, great. May I go on and ask some additional
Please
questions?
do.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So we have a question. Amy Jean says, I was raised by the East Branch of the Westfield River, also called Waronoko. Could you translate the word Waronoko?
Let's see. I can't remember off the top of my head. So it roughly means where the river winds around the land.
Okay,
That's just a rough translation.
great. Okay, and Vivian Orlowski says, thank you for another enlightening presentation. How would you suggest elementary and secondary schools provide education to help students understand Indigenous heritage and history to counteract cultural stereotypes? Boy, do you have a few more hours we could discuss this?
I know. So here's the thing, is that many tribal nations have now created educational websites. So whenever possible, it's really important to locate those sites and go to them. And so even with my college students, I always have to advise people, do not go to Wikipedia. Do not go to amateur historians who have created their own web pages, but go to respected museums or tribal nations so that you can hear a more authoritative sense of the history. And then the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association created a remarkable website called Raid on Deerfield, The Many Stories of 1704 back in 2004. And that looks at that particular event from Abenaki, Mohawk, Huron, French, and English perspectives. And there was a very large team of over 30 consultants, including myself, but who worked on this from each of those nations, including tribal experts and historians. And it's a remarkable amount of information in a single website. And interestingly enough, we have not felt compelled to update or change any of it because virtually all of it is still very effective. And every few years, PVMA gets grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do teacher workshops where teachers develop curriculum in the classroom. So it sounds odd to use a massacre or an attack as a lens through which to view the past, but it can be a compelling place to start. And then historic Northampton, much of what I share with you tonight is encoded in an essay that I'm writing for Historic Northampton, which is an expansion of an article that I wrote several years ago, actually about a decade ago. So I'm now updating that so it has a lot more information. So that's just a general, advice of where to go.
Great. Well, it's a great head start. Okay. As I say, many people are writing in to congratulate you on this lecture, to thank you for your decades of work and research. And I'm seeing you've truly made our place, world, and our world better. So thanks again. Okay, here's a question. Where might I find more info on the burial or end of life rituals of the local Native peoples?
Not something I'm comfortable talking about.
Okay. Would Williamsburg, Massachusetts have been lived in by the Nonotuck peoples?
No. Oh, I'm sorry, Williamsburg. I was thinking Williamstown. My
No,
mistake.
Williamsburg.
Williamsburg, yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, and here's something from Michael Wilcox, who I hope will forgive me, as I hope you will if I mispronounce this. Kwinitekw. Did I say that right?
Greetings, friend. Yeah.
Wonderful. I have read somewhere that quote unquote redskins to describe Native people came from describing scalps, not the color of their complexion. Can you comment?
I can, and I will probably get some flack for this, but what I have found in digging through the records is that the first use of redskins came about simply because Native people painted their skin red. So they used red ochre, bear grease, and a variety of things to color their skin as protective, as decorative, often as a way of dressing oneself for war. So that's the first use of the term redskin, and it occurs frequently in the colonial era with that in mind. I have never found an historical source that identifies scalps as redskins. There are a few people who insist that it exists, but it's very, very rare, and it's not the most common usage.
Okay, thank you. And I see that you've put something in the chat on scalps, so thank you for that. And I see that Carol has put a link in the chat as well about the raid on Deerfield.
Oh, good. I was just trying to find that.
So thank you.
Hard to type and answer questions at the same time.
That's exactly how I feel. So thank you, Carol, for taking the lead on that. And that's it right now, unless anyone wants to get a last minute comment in. But before we go, I would be remiss, first of all, if I didn't thank you profusely, Professor Bruchac. This has been amazing. And I don't know what else to say, except this has been wonderful. So very, very much appreciated. And of course, everyone is aware now about the project that University Days at Ollie is doing on We Are Still Here about Indigenous peoples of the Northeast. And I just wanted to mention that we have Portraits in Red, which is the art exhibit by Indigenous artist Nayana LaFond, opening this Friday at the Lichtenstein Center with an artist talk at 3 p.m. on Friday, September 2nd. And the opening reception will also be at the Lichtenstein Center from 5 to 8 p.m. And now, of course, we have 5 new messages. So if you're
I'm just putting a few things in the chat. So I just put a link to my Wampum Trail project.
Great.
So people know what that is.
Great. And let's see. So someone was asking if places like ancestry.com have good information for Indigenous ancestry, would you say?
Not really. And the reason I would say that is because if you know who you're looking for specifically, it can be really helpful. But the biggest problem with ancestry.com is the amateur genealogists. So in many cases, people have created genealogical chains of a relationship that aren't really anchored in reality. And in some cases, people have actually trolled some people by creating fake genealogical chains for people they wish to discredit. So ancestry.com is useful if you're looking for the documents. So it's a great way to find particular documents, particular source material. And it's the same advice, again, that I give my college students. Go to primary sources and be wary of secondary sources who have an axe to grind or who have a particular political opinion or angle. And sometimes people will simply come up with a theory first and then create something that they think supports it that may not be anchored in fact. So just be wary.
Wow.
I guess is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, how unfortunate, but good suggestions. So you mentioned, well, the subject of the King Philip's War came up, and Kate Kidd wants to remind us that there's a tapestry about the King Philip's War in the Agawam exhibit, which is currently in place at the gallery at Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, which is also part of the We Are Still Here exhibit. It was created by Judy Dow, who is an artist who is also Abenaki.
And the word is Akwikigan.
I'm sorry, I
That's
stand
okay.
corrected. Akwikigan. I'm going to practice. So thank you for that.
And I know that Jennifer Lee has given a shout out for the Indigenous Voices in the Connecticut River Valley to the Nolan Baker Project.
Right.
A great source for teachers and educators. Sorry, it didn't come immediately to mind.
Well, good. That's why we have Jennifer Lee on this Zoom.
Yeah.
So that's great. So unless anyone has any last minute comments or questions, we are now at 8:31, and again,
And I have one more thing I'd like to share with you.
absolutely.
And there's kind of a backstory to it. The at Springfield College, my colleague and friend Laurel Davis Delano wanted to create a land acknowledgement for Agawam, and we created a website to answer that question. And now that I think about it, I should have given you this answer earlier, because the website also includes links to a number of sources for teaching about Native presence, Native visibility, et cetera, et cetera. So here is the link for that.
Great.
Hang on one sec.
Thank you.
And the other thing that's nice about that website is that we also realize that many people don't know who's who. So we included a page that has links to tribal nations, and it's for southeastern New England. But so it has links to addresses and websites. There's a whole list of resources. So Southern New England Native American nations, local Native history, state and federal agencies, US national organizations. So actually, now that I'm thinking about it, that's a great place for teachers to start, because the first point of confusion is who's who. What is a tribal nation? Where are they? How do we know how people are related and who to work with? So that's a great source.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And also, Carol put a note in here that the Nolam Beka project is a series of short films of Indigenous artists, elders, and educators that's free to all, made with schools in mind.
Yeah.
So that's another resource. So thank you for that. And Carol is also reminding everyone that the presentation will be posted later on the OLLI YouTube page, and she's put the link in to that. So
great.
Once again, everyone is coming in with their thank yous and their kudos, and they're all very well deserved. It has been my honor and pleasure to assist with this presentation, Dr. Bruchac, and thanks to everyone from all over the world who has assisted. There were a couple of hundred people on here at one time, so thank you all for attending, and I think with that we'll say good night.
Great, you're very welcome. Willie O'Neill, thank you. And Willie Nanawalmasi, be well.
And you too.